Hello, everyone. And I think this is the first time I'm recording in the morning, but I didn't get things done. So it's the 21st of July, and I am recording the day we're posting the episode. We being me, just the royal we, since it's only me posting it. But just a lot going on right now. I did a 15-minute comedy set last night, which is long for someone to get, really. That's a long time. Usually you go and do 5 minutes. I did 3 minutes last week, which was really short because I was away from home for about 6 hours to do 3 minutes on stage, but I love it. So that's what happens. I'm preparing for Camden Fringe. That's a festival in Camden where I'm living in London, and doing a show. So if you're in London, August 8th through 11th and the 15th are the dates of the show. It's called Nice Try. It's on a double bill with another comic, Stephanie Lawrence. And it's been a really interesting exercise to put a show together. I mean, it's a half hour. I'm hoping to build it into longer. I'll see what happens after this Fringe, but that's my intention. And it's just one of those goals. If anything, it's my first of a few or many solo shows, or if anything, it's just a item that was on the bucket list that I've poured a lot into. I'm going to be previewing it online on Zoom on the 25th of July and the 1st of August as well. So if you don't follow me at my account, Rabia Comedy, you can do that, or just email morethanworkpod@gmail.com and I can get you a link. But I'd love for people to listen, and I never know who's listening to the podcast because there are more listeners than I'm aware of. Of course, I'm aware of like 4 or 5 of my friends who follow me just diligently, and I'm so excited that other people are hearing it. So this week's guest is Jamie Padilla, and I'll introduce her in a minute on the podcast too, but we went to high school together, and we definitely hung out in different crews, or I didn't really have a crew, I guess. Just hung out with different people, but we were also in junior high together, and she's always really nice, just a really nice person, and really funny. Like, I just remember her just being hilarious. And so it was cool when I met her at my 20-year reunion a couple years ago and just saw what she had been up to. And she's really this incredible woman, and she's in labor unions for agriculture. And I don't know much about that. I mean, it's definitely something I've looked into to understand more, especially just with certain political stuff going on in the U.S. But it was really cool to talk to her and get to understand what she does and just the kind of work she's in, which is really meaningful to her, and really is she's one of those people who's doing a job that fulfills her because of the cause that it's for. And then she also does flamenco on the side, which is really cool too, and she's a performer. So I loved this chat. I loved getting to know her in a different way. I think that's the most rewarding thing for me about doing this podcast, and I hope it's rewarding for you as a listener, just to hear different people's stories and to hear what they're about. And I'd really love if anyone's inspired by something they hear and it leads them to doing something. Let me know. I'd love to hear about that. But I think that's it for this week. I've plugged my stuff. Now, of course, if I've plugged this and you're listening to this 2 months from now or even a month from now, it probably won't be relevant, but at least you know I was doing something. And talked about the guest, and I think that's what I was here to do right now. So I'll leave it to you to listen to the rest of the episode, and if you want to, drop me a line on any of the social media or email and let me know what you think. Thank you. Welcome to More Than Work, the podcast reminding you that your self-worth is defined by more than your job title. I'm Rabia, an IT project manager, comedian, nonprofit volunteer, and sometimes activist. Every week, I'll chat with a guest about pursuing passions outside of work or creating meaningful opportunities inside the workplace. As you listen, I hope you'll be inspired to do the same. Here we go. Hey everyone, welcome back this week. I could have almost called this podcast like high school reunion at this point because I have another person I went to high school and junior high with. but people are doing cool things. So it's just great to get to talk to them and connect with them as adults and about their careers and lives. And so this week is Jamie Padilla. She's Asesora del Campo, producer services manager. Did I say that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I still see the high school Spanish is paying off. Yeah. So Jamie, why don't you introduce yourself to the More Than Work audience?
Yeah, great to be here today and seeing you here. I know your audience isn't seeing you, but this is really nice to connect. I'm Jamie Padilla. I live in Los Angeles and I work for Fair Trade USA. I've been with the organization for a little over a year and a half. Prior to that, I was with United Farm Workers, UFW, United Farm Workers of America, for a little over 11 years. And my kind of personal mission that I'm really looking to live out through my professional career is really to turn the tide, I'd say, on what I would describe very much as a downward spiral when it comes to mostly labor practices, but others as well, environmental and in agriculture. It's not unique to agriculture, but I'm very drawn to wanting to impact that particular sector. So I spent 11 years trying to do so through the collective bargaining and now through helping farmers to adopt best practices and helping workers, to get the most out of. There's a whole host of programs out there now with, consumers wanting brands and retailers to be responsible in their sourcing practices.
Cool. No, that's awesome. And it's work, I think, that impacts everybody, the work you're doing, because we all get our food and consume food that comes from farms and from the people who work on farms, and whether it's like big corporate agriculture or even smaller. What did you do right after we knew each other, and how did you end up all the way to now working in unions over the last 13 or so years?
Right after college, I took a break. I think I worked in restaurants. I worked in like a YMCA or something. And then I went to College of the Canyons, COC. It's a community college for 2 years, transferred to UCLA from there. And when I graduated from UCLA, I was a teacher for a while. Mm-hmm. I taught in special education. And then I decided to go back to school. I got my master's and came out and took a position with the United Farm Workers as a researcher. I started as a researcher, but wound up wearing a lot of hats while I was there. So I ran different campaigns. I did a lot of political work and, got some experience on the ground organizing in farm worker communities. And then from there, I moved on to Fair Trade USA to help launch a new program in dairy with Chobani. Chobani yogurt, to come up with the standards and the activities that would help make dairies, better places to work and more sustainable businesses. That's what I'm doing now.
It's so cool. And that's a huge brand. I think everybody will know who they are. So when you ended up at United Farm Workers in the first place as a researcher, were you seeking out that specific type of work?
Yeah, actually, I got the exact job I wanted. So I really, really wanted to do research in the labor movement for a union. And I especially wanted to work with farm workers. So I wanted the UFW. And the stars kind of aligned. And I got lucky because the person who had my position before me also went to my program. And so when she left, she pinged me about it. And I applied and got it. Yeah. So I thought that she had recommended me, and it turns out that the hiring manager for the position didn't hear about me. So it was just kind of funny how it all worked, but I was at least informed of the position and applied on account of her alerting me. So yeah, it was a good moment of alignment there.
Yeah, for sure. And what was the program you did your master's study in?
In public policy.
Oh,
and I'm
great.
not doing anything in public policy.
Yeah, no.
I finished it. I think I finished it realizing, no, I'm glad I did it. I think it afforded me the opportunity to reassess and when you're kind of just plugging away and you're working, it can be challenging, right? To so I was in my 20s. To take a step back and assess whether or not you're on the right path. And I think, by taking a break from the workforce and going back to school, that was probably the most valuable part of that was I stopped and like gave it some thought. And I
Yeah.
probably wouldn't have done that if I just had kept kind of plugging away in the daily grind.
Yeah, no, for sure. But with the public policy, so I'm in right now, and I'm sorry people are going to hear me drop this a couple times on this podcast and I'll be done with it. But I'm right now in a public leadership course at Harvard Kennedy, and it was an alternative to me doing a master's in public policy just because now we're about 20 years older than you were when you did that. And so, life's different. Taking a year off of work is different, right?
Is this a certificate program?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like and so one thing I was taking, or I am taking it for, is just to have a better understanding of policy and how policy is written and delivered and evidence. Do you feel like your perspective has changed just having an understanding of all that?
It's really interesting that you asked that because I feel like I got a solid education on the technicalities of how the sausage is made, right? Like we spent a lot of time doing a lot of fancy econometrics, and it was a very mathy program. At the end of it all, I came to, the earth-shattering conclusion that policy is about politics. Glad to be literate in these things. If I read some analysis, I feel like having that educational background is helpful there. But yeah, at the end of the day, it really comes down to power and influence, right?
Yeah.
And everything that goes into that, money being a big one, but other factors as well, being organized, for example.
Yeah, and then going into organizing and labor. So what made you interested in specifically agriculture? Was there something?
Yeah. Well, I actually, when I was in grad school, I was interested in international development and saw myself kind of doing development work in Latin America, and I spent a lot of time in Mexico in migrant sending communities, and realized that working with immigrants here in the US is kind of just the flip side of the same coin. I wound up doing projects there when you go to these communities, it's mostly women, children, and elderly people. It's probably shifted in a lot of them now. There's been reverse migration. But this was in 2007, 2008. And so I worked with a women's cooperative that was looking to expand into international markets with mostly handicrafts. But they did some kind of like artisan treats and whatnot, made like shampoos from nopal and all kinds of fun stuff, basket. And so then I became interested in trade issues. And so it's cool that I wound up at Fair Trade. But yeah, farm workers here, it's largely an immigrant workforce, mostly an undocumented immigrant workforce. They're sending money back, a lot of them. Some stay and have families here, a lot actually. And so I just kind of felt like it was very much on the same continuum of where I'd been investing my time and energies before.
Yeah. So what part of the work for you is just thinking, I mean, not what you're doing now, but during the time you were working with the United Farm Workers, what part of the work surprised you the most?
I would say a big takeaway for me, I don't know if it's the biggest surprise necessarily, but it's definitely, it shifted my perspective a lot. I went in, I'd get assigned to kind of lead big activities like, a march or a protest when we were campaigning against Meg Whitman in, what was that, 2010, when she ran against Jerry Brown. We did a lot of activities around that. And I'd go in feeling this pressure to like take all this leadership on, and realize like I'm there as a servant to facilitate. Like this is their activity. This is their campaign. This is their fight. And I'm just here to help with the logistics of it. And I got schooled by farm workers in very gentle ways. I think I went in maybe from a place of arrogance. I don't know. I think it was kind of also just feeling that pressure of like, oh, I need to like prove myself and take, and be assertive and take action. And, as a woman too, you feel that,
Yeah.
right? Like you feel this pressure to take it by the reins. And over the course of my years there, I really learned that that's not how, that wasn't the way for me to be, as impactful as I could be there. It's their fight. And that was very humbling for me. I was very much, my contributions were always welcome there. I wound up just learning a lot from workers who've been fighting, for, these are union members, right? So they already have their, their collective bargaining agreements with their benefits and improved wages relative to their counterparts, and all of that. But they invest so much of their very limited free time fighting to ensure that more and more of their fellow farm workers can have that. So, they'll travel to Sacramento, they'll travel to Washington, D.C. They're out on the weekends knocking on doors, campaigning, and so their work is hard. So it's just, I would say the biggest takeaway for me was how humbling of an experience it was to work there. I think my growth there, I did have some professional development opportunities, but more than anything, I feel like it just really humbled me as a human being.
Yeah. And I think that realization you came to is a really good one, because just in having, I interviewed a guest that I really impacted me a lot was Lucia Nunez, who worked for the Biden campaign, and she worked with the volunteers on that campaign. And just her telling me that a lot of volunteers come in with like a savior complex. I took a diversity, it wasn't a diversity and inclusion training, but it was along those lines. I can't remember exactly what it was with them, and learn that, like, and yeah, it's like the importance of me as an individual volunteering is not of priority. It's the importance of the cause that I'm volunteering for and putting that first and at the center. And I think that lesson you learned is super valuable. And the fact that they were willing to tell you rather than just reject you or something is really says a lot too.
Yeah. One moment stands out to me where I was working with coffee workers. So they weren't union members because this was in a different country. I did a lot of work internationally when I was with the UFW too. So while the UFW is a union, it also, the organization is on the front lines of improving farm workers' lives in a lot of different ways outside of, collective bargaining, because there's so few farm workers who have union contracts, right? So we did a lot of work outside of that. And for me, that took me to probably 7 different countries. One I spent a lot of time in was Nicaragua, and I worked with coffee workers. And I was on the farm once when a coffee buyer came from a big company I'm not going to name. And workers were pitching this buyer on buying their coffee, at a premium rate so that they could have, under this model where they'd get extra earnings, they'd get bonuses from the premium that the buyer was going to pay. And so the buyer's listening, and then he says, well, I could pay you all this premium. How do I know you're going to do something good with it? What if you just go drink it away? Or how do I know you're not going to just, blow it on this and blow it on that? And I was just like fuming. And I thought, oh my God, like I felt really compelled to speak up and just shut this guy down. And I'm like fuming, but I'm like, oh my God, but I don't want to mess up. They're trying to get this guy to buy. Like, I don't want to mess that up. But I'm just like, had this moment of conflict internally. And then he starts going on and on about the virtues of micro entrepreneurialism. And have you considered investing in a chicken coop? Like, just weird, and the workers are just looking at him. Finally, one of the workers speaks up and says, hey, let me ask you a question. Do you make your living off of coffee? And the guy's like, yeah, of course I do. He goes, do you have a chicken coop? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad I didn't open my mouth. It was a savior complex moment for me where I felt like I have to defend them, And then I was like, thank God I kept my mouth shut, because that guy just shut him down way better. And it was so good.
Well, what's insane too is like, none of my employers have ever asked me when they give me a bonus, for example,
Exactly.
And I'm more likely to blow it on something stupid.
Yeah, I was like,
You know,
guess
like
what
the
I'd go
people
blow
who
it on.
right, like yes, I would buy drinks and, I don't know, whatever, Chipotle. I don't know what I'd buy, but I mean the thing is like, I'd probably go out to eat and get drinks or something with part of my bonus. Yes, but I would never expect my employer to ask me that or say like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous. God, and then just like a chicken coop. And then what, you want them to eat their own chickens or what? Like that's mean. That's crazy. I guess when you look at the issues of workers in the states versus workers outside the states and like the different countries you went to, did you find a lot of commonalities? Did you find like in different in different countries there were?
No, it's the same across the board in agriculture, and this is probably one of the reasons why I continue to be drawn to working in the fields, literally in the field. Everywhere you go, it doesn't really matter where. The workers that are doing the hard work there come from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in Costa Rica, the workers that are harvesting the coffee there probably came from Panama or Nicaragua.
Mm.
Here, they hail from Mexico, from Central America, and we do have a guest worker program here. It's called the H2A visa program, where workers can come for seasonal work and then go back. And they're also mostly from Mexico and some Central Americans. I went to Brazil, and the workers who were on the coffee farms I visited there came from other states, like really far away. And migration is just the norm in
Mm.
ag. And I lived in Mexico, in a state called Guanajuato, and the farm workers there came from Guerrero. The farm workers in Baja come from Oaxaca. Like it's just
Yeah.
that's ag. Everyone comes from somewhere else. I know it's not totally unique to ag, but it's more ubiquitous in agriculture than it is
Mm-hmm.
in other industries, right? And that vulnerability that accompanies migration tends to produce a lot of the same things, a lot of the same abuses and bad practices. And it really just stems from that. It stems from people not having really meaningful choices and having to do this hard work for low pay and taking on the risks of migrating to do it, sometimes putting up their family home or property as collateral to get work, especially if they're trying to get work here in the US. And that vulnerability perpetuates some of the poor practices that already exist. And it can, it can result in even worse, right? Because it results in people not speaking up
Mm-hmm.
out of fear. So what it really creates is an environment of fear. The vulnerability creates an environment. It's like
Yeah.
self-perpetuating like cycle, right?
Yeah. Well, and I guess one thing, I mean, just is to the dehumanization of these workers by society, I would say. I mean, I don't think that's a stretch to say that occurs. I mean, I think even they're having Brexit over here, but then during COVID in the States too, like there's been a shortage of workers in some cases. Mm-hmm. And then also this expectation that they should be putting themselves on the line and their health on the line to harvest the food and whatever is in the, they are whatever they're harvesting, mostly food products, right? And so I just feel like too, then a lot of people will say things like, oh, the illegals and the whatever, and just assume like all the workers, like this visa program you said. But I just think there's this dehumanization I've heard time and time again, especially like politically. And what's your experience in hearing that? Like maybe when people hear where you work or what you do, and you might not put yourself in situations where you're around people who would say stuff like that, but what has your experience been?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think overall it's a huge impediment to progress, politically for for these groups. So, it's one of the biggest reasons why that in the U.S., for example. Sorry, I know you're asking about my personal experience, and
no, but that's fine.
There's a lot, but just kind of taking it up a notch at a higher level here. I feel like it's probably in the States one of the biggest factors to why farm workers can't count on the same protections as that most everyone else can. Domestic workers too, and farm workers and domestic workers are explicitly exempt from things like the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there's a legacy of of slavery and racism in ag that goes way back to the beginning of our country. And there's remnants of that perpetuate today, including, the exemptions from all these really basic labor protections. So farm workers can't count on overtime pay, paid time off. In some states, they don't have workers' comp. They don't have the right to organize and collectively bargain. Like, they're explicitly exempt from these laws and protections. So, and I think that the political will to change that is impacted by the reality that it's largely an undocumented workforce.
Right.
Personally, I've been, on campaigns where we've been in very public spaces where I have seen probably some of the just worst kind of racist reactions and derogatory treatment I think I've ever seen. Like that Meg Whitman campaign I had mentioned earlier. Farm workers often bring their kids, when we go in, when we go and take over Sacramento for a day or whatever, they travel with their kids. They don't have nannies.
Right.
They bring their kids. And I remember being on this campaign where we were demonstrating outside of the facilities where Meg Whitman and Jerry Brown were debating. And we had signs and we're kind of, whatever we were singing, whatever. And this woman who was probably in her 40s or 50s turns to a child, a little girl, and said, well, you need to tell your parents to go back to where they came from.
Mm.
And I was like, and she's yelling at this little girl saying racist things and to a child.
Right. Yeah. Who has nothing to do with anything.
Oh, yeah. I'll see different treatment. It's easy to pick on those who are latently racist, but where it really would piss me off the most is where you're not expecting it, right? Like you're on a campaign with allies, you think, and you realize oh, they're putting the farm workers in the crappy hotel and other workers, and okay, interesting.
Yeah. Where it's more like that's when you get the implicit kind of actions that they're not as overt, but they're still clearly differentiating between people by what they do.
Yeah.
When you left United Farm Workers and made the transition over to the Fair Trade USA. Yeah. Did your focus, did it change basically more from working directly with the workers to more on the more of a policy level, organizationally, or how's the shift been?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah. I think I spend a lot of my time on program development. The sheer volume of internal meetings I participate in was a huge shift for me. So I worked a lot of hours when I worked at the UFW, but I was out in the field a lot, or out in communities, or out at events, right? And that all counted as work for me. So I wasn't in front of a computer, but maybe just a few days a week, right? If even. But now I am on Zoom all day, every day, which of course is exacerbated by the pandemic, but it would have been the case otherwise because I do work remotely and was hired to work remotely. So I do hands-on work with the farms that I work with. And so I'll visit, I'll do trainings with workers, and a lot of kind of facilitation of getting people integrated into the fair trade program, getting, coming into compliance with the standards and being able to set up the whole infrastructure that makes it impactful. But it's a much smaller percentage of my use of time than, what I had anticipated. But I'm learning a lot about just the inner workings of supply chains. And that's been really, really interesting for me.
And probably just from a volume perspective too, right? The amount of goods that move, that go from farm to factory to, table.
And how that happens. In order for fair trade to work, the buyer or the brand or the supermarket pays a premium. So tracing that that process of, from farm to shelf is really, it gets really complex. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So can you explain the concept of fair trade to people who don't know what it is?
Yeah, so when it's a market-driven approach to improving people's lives. Really, it started as a movement in Latin America, in the developing
Okay.
world, to facilitate. It was an anti-poverty movement, with the idea being that through farmer organizing, small farmers, there's opportunity to leverage fairer prices and more transparency in supply chains. And that grew. It really grew in coffee, and then kind of took off in cocoa, sugar, bananas, but mostly like tropical commodities, right? And since then, it's grown to, you can get fair trade roses at Whole Foods, or you
Mm.
can get a lot of fair trade produce at Costco. It kind of evolved to fit into this demand for socially responsible products, right? So big brands that are looking to, not just big brands, there's a lot of niche brands too, but those who are trying to ensure supply chain transparency, responsibility, investment. It's kind of a saturated space. There's a lot of different like certifications and
Mm.
approaches. And in coffee now, there's like buyers who are like, well, we do direct trade or whatever. This is fair trade now it's a certification. It's evolved to become certification where there are standards. So
Okay.
if you become fair trade certified, you're audited against these standards, and then you get a premium for what you sell, and that premium is used to invest in projects largely. So they tend to be, if you're in the developing world, workers will build a clinic or a
Oh.
school or housing. Here in the US, we now have fair trade here, domestic fair trade. And we have building codes and like so we can't really just go and build a school so easily. But workers will use their fair trade premium to offset the cost of healthcare, even in medical, like a medical plan, or they'll do clinic days where they'll bring a bunch of providers to come and do checkups with workers, or they'll start a scholarship fund for workers' kids, lots of different things. They're at full discretion in coming up with these investment plans and project plans. And as a program, we advise on kind of what that decision making process should look like and
Mhm.
how to prepare people to be able to participate in it in a meaningful way. So they got to go through training and know how to interview their coworkers, for example, to understand what their needs and priorities are, so that when they do
Right.
develop a project, it's actually reflective of the needs and priorities of the broader, workforce in their workplace, or if it's small farmers, in their community.
Right. Huh. This year, I mean, your project was had a lot to do with bringing this to the specific company that Chobani or
Bringing it to dairy. So
okay.
Chobani was the one to step up and say, we really want this. Can you figure this out? But it's open to the whole industry, and we hope that now you can get fair trade Chobani yogurt on the market now, and I hope that pretty soon you'll get fair trade yogurt. I mean, ice cream and cheese and maybe even raw milk. But yeah, it started off as a pilot because we took the model as we have it and the standards as they exist and just applied them as they are, basically, with the most
Mhm.
minor of tweaks, to then kind of, but it's very much the culture of our organization to learn by doing. Like we love
Right.
innovation. It's a Bay Area based organization.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we just kind of like to get out there, mix it up, and then from there figure out, how we can make it better. So that's what we've spent this last year doing, is just, okay, here we've got this standard, let's try it out. It's not going to be perfect, everyone. We just know that ahead of time. There's going to be some funkiness, and it's really interesting because the standard requires the establishment of these fair trade committees made up of
Mhm.
workers. They have to be elected, and there's requirements around how it be representative of the entire workforce demographically, and then in terms of different roles and positions. So like if you're a temporary worker, a permanent worker in dairy, are you working in the milking parlor, are you working on the cropping side of the operation, whatever, like it needs to be representative. But in dairy in the US, there's an immigrant workforce doing a lot of the milking side, the dairying side. And then there's a lot of English speaking, probably American workers kind of operating equipment and doing maintenance and they're distinct roles. But these folks will all participate together in this committee where they will be investing together like hundreds of thousands of dollars in projects to benefit their entire workforce and community. So it's an interesting opportunity to just bridge those gaps communication wise, culturally. And I'm not negating that they might have some different needs and priorities, but they're gonna be working through that, and it'll be interesting.
So as a consumer, like I know, for example, the label of organic got kind of exploited over time because is it true there was no, like, if you know this, if you don't, it's fine, no governing body over what's organic necessarily? I read that somewhere.
There's different ones is part of the problem, right? There's like USDA organic, there's whatever it is, CCOS. There's a bunch of different ones. And I would say the social responsibility space is similar in that there are different sets of standards, right? The standards tend to be more aligned. If you take like fair trade and the EFI or Rainforest Alliance and you like line them up, the basic requirements that a farm or an employer or a producer would have to meet, there aren't like glaring differences there. The differences tend to be kind of more in the model and how we define and drive impact.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's more standardized. So if someone sees the Fair Trade USA label, then they can know that in buying that product, they are contributing to this like collective good for farms.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really transparent. Like you can go on the website and see what the standards are. You can hear from producers directly on what their experience is with it. I would say in the social responsibility space, there's some really solid third-party certification schemes out there. Where it tends to get more greenwashy is when there's not a third-party verified certification.
Got it.
So, like in coffee, for example, especially kind of more independent roasters and coffee shops like to boast about how they engage in direct trade. And that's great. I'm not like, I don't want to, poo-poo on that, but it can mean anything to anyone. There's no it just means you're buying directly from a farm, and that could mean you show up and you pick the best quality coffee from that particular farmer and take a selfie and leave, right? You might not ever stop to ask about the working conditions, or hey, you have a seasonal workforce. Do they live in employer provided housing? What does that look like? Can I look at it? Coffee buyers tend to obsess over quality. And they're probably like looking at at the cafetales, looking at what's on the tree and all those things that impact quality. They might not think of the things that I would think of if I were to go out to a farm. I would want to see farm worker housing. I'd want to, know how workers are getting paid. How does that process work, and how are they hired? How are they dispatched into the cafetales? Those kinds of things. What is turnover like?
Yeah. What happens if they get sick? Things like, do they have access to medical care? Do they have access to food during the day, breaks, stuff like that, right? Like there's all kinds of ways they could be exploited, like you said before, and have no power to say anything other than, so just keep working, right?
Yeah. And there's also a lot more nuance that tends to get missed where, when we think of child labor, we think of an employer exploiting a kid. But a lot of times what you see is kids are, like in Central America, the school year, the academic calendar is built around the coffee harvest. And so kids are out of school when everyone's harvesting coffee, and sometimes they don't have anywhere else to go. And their family members are all out there, and that's where they want to be. And I'm not saying it's dangerous. like there's snakes and spiders. I'm not saying that that's where they should be, but as Americans, we tend to think like, oh my God, these employers are exploiting these kids, and the kids are the ones that are like, no, we want to be out here. So you just have to understand the nuance before you go in
Yeah.
and try to change the practice, right? Like
Yeah.
there's,
Like,
there's a lot more impacting that than just it's like blatant discrimination or blatant exploitation, right?
yeah, because I mean, it is culture. And I think in America, generally speaking, and I'm even speaking as someone who I am lacking like the culture of my father's side. He's from Lebanon, and I don't have any of that. And I became
Mm-hmm.
more and more aware of that as I've gotten older. But I think in America, we like to just take away culture. And I'm not even talking about appropriation of culture. I'm just talking about taking away, like people who speak a foreign language don't do it anymore. I
Mm-hmm.
think language to me is one of the most like horrible things that we've done to people in America is take away language from them and say only English and made it so that if they're speaking something else, it's a problem. But I think, yeah, when you go to another country, especially like you have to understand their culture because not everyone's trying to be America, right? I mean, that's the thing. Not everyone's after that. Or even the fact that they call it America when really America is this continent versus the
Right.
US. But yeah, not understanding the culture and what maybe, yeah, what those families need. Maybe that's the time they're spending together. You're right. I mean, it's important to look at all that.
Yeah, I mean, it can run the gamut, right? Like sometimes it is really exploitative blatantly, but sometimes there's other things going on.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and it just the nuance gets missed. And
Yeah. So consumers can definitely, though, if they see that fair trade label, they should feel pretty good. Like with Chobani, for example, that they're contributing to something. And
yeah, so there's standards underlying it, but in addition to that, I would say one of the most impactful things about fair trade is the premium that goes back to the
Mhm.
producer. And if the producer, they're not always employers per se, right? Sometimes the producer is a small farmer. But in the case where it's an employer and there's workers, that money goes to the workers and they manage it democratically through their committees.
Yeah.
So that's something unique that and while those projects in and of themselves are impactful and valuable, what I really like about it, where I find the magic of fair trade is it gets people participating in a way that they never
Mhm.
have before and exercising agency in a way that they probably hadn't before. And then, they really start to discover their own voice through that. And it leads to changes in the workplace
Mhm.
that go just way beyond what the standard requires.
Yeah.
So there's fair trade on paper, and then there's the fair trade you see when you actually go out to a farm, or there are actually factories that are fair trade certified now too. So you can get fair trade like jeans and yeah.
It's great that the companies are seeking this out too. Chobani being a leader in that, for example, but seeking this out. And it is at cost to them in some ways, right? Because they're implementing things.
Yeah. So some brands will pass along that additional cost to the consumer. And so like sometimes you'll see certified products, not just fair trade, but any certified product will cost a little bit more. Some don't. Some see it as just as plain old like risk management and good business. And
Mm-hmm.
they just consider it a cost of doing good business and good supply chain management. And they don't like in the case of this yogurt, Chwani didn't raise the price
Mm.
of that yogurt in the marketplace. So
Huh. Yeah. Well, that's cool. So then, as far as outside of work, one thing I know you're interested in flamenco, right?
yeah,
Yes.
that's a little bit of work for me too. Yeah, on the weekends.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you got involved and what you do with it now? And
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. I dance here locally, mostly in restaurants. So like when you go see a flamenco show, you might go to a theater and see a show, but often you're going to a tablao show where you're sitting down and having tapas or a meal or sangria or whatever and watching a show. It's more informal. Sometimes it's in a bar, sometimes it's in a dining room. And I dance in some of those shows here locally. And it's really fun. I work hard during the week, so I get to go and blow off steam. I get paid to do it, but it's more for
nice.
fun, and the community of it. When you flamenco, when you perform, you do it in what we call the cuadro, which is dancer, musician, and percussion. Sometimes an actual instrument for percussion, but a lot of times it's your hand, and all of that has to work together. So there's a lot of improvisation, and it's kind of like jazz, where you're playing off one another, and there's a lot of just exchange happening on stage where it's largely led by the dancer. So if the dancer starts to speed up, the musicians speed up. But then there are moments where, as a dancer, you're following what the singer's doing. If a singer like holds a note for a really long time, you hold it with them. It's a lot of improvisation, a lot of just constant engagement on stage. But yeah, no, I'm not from Andalusia. I'm from LA. So I had to learn taking workshops and traveling to study with different people, and it's and mostly I've learned from the different artists that I've had the opportunity to be on stage with.
So when did you start doing that?
I started taking classes when I was in college, and then at UCLA, one of my teachers started a group, and we mostly were doing like theater shows. She was choreographing and staging. It was very theatrical flamenco, but she wound up getting a regular gig for us. And what I learned was, really where we became, where we really started to learn real flamenco was when we were in these little gigs. It's not in these theaters where everything is like highly choreographed and, tacked and everything like that. So once we got in on these smaller stages with musicians, that sometimes you'll show up for a gig and you don't know the people that you're working with. At this point we kind of all know each other, but
Have you been able to perform since things started opening up, or not yet?
I just started again. So I had my first gig in May, and then I just had my second one last Saturday.
Oh, great. Yeah. Awesome. So people want to find you, where can they do that?
Yeah, I don't like have a website for it or anything like that, but I dance at Cafe Sevilla in Orange County and in Long Beach, and have danced off and on at a place called El Cid and a place called Alegría. Alegría is also in Long Beach. El Cid is here in Los Angeles. But they don't have a flamenco show there right now, but maybe we're hoping. Yeah. So yeah, kind of all over. But the flamenco community in Los Angeles is strong. We have a lot of good artists here.
Cool. Yeah, and I interrupted you, but how was it being back and doing it?
It was weird and fun. It felt really good, but it felt surreal. I hadn't been around people outside of kind of my pod that I've had here. Mostly we hang out at my house, and it's Orange County, and that's different than LA. Just the place was pretty packed, and even walking from my car to the venue, nobody had masks on or anything, and that was strange for me. Yeah. Just kind of shocking to the system. I was like, whoa, this is intense.
yeah, it is. Even just going out, we're in London, a lot of people are still wearing masks. Some are on the tube. It's 50-50 in stores. Everyone is. So it is weird when, the other week I went to Brighton, and it was everybody was just out without one because everyone's outside. But it was weird to see so many faces. It's cool that you do that and even have been able to perform in front of people and get paid for it and everything. Because that's kind of a dream for any artist, right? To be able to do that with their art. Is there anything you want to cover that we didn't?
Yeah, you're such a good interviewer. This was really a fun conversation. You make it flow so nicely. I guess, kind of just thinking through what I understand to be your intent and message with the podcast, I would add I'm a single mom. I'm doing this all as a single mom. And wow. So if there are any other single moms who are listening, first of all, hats off. It's really challenging. And in my experience, I find that the biggest challenge is to strike a balance between just knowing when to go in full throttle hustle mode and to tap into your toughness, and then knowing when to give yourself grace. You've got to go in and out of that. Like, you have to be tough. You don't have a choice. You know, if you're going to thrive and progress and advance and provide, you've got to be tough as nails. But then, you know, if you're just in that mode constantly, you'll wear yourself down. I've been probably overly hard on myself during this pandemic. And I've learned that, you know what, like, it's really, you do yourself a lot of good by extending yourself some grace.
Yeah, no, that's great. And usually I ask like if someone has advice, but basically that was it. So that's awesome. And yeah, we do have single moms listening. I did a Mother's Day episode with my sister and another friend who are single moms, and then a friend who's married, and it was really cool. But I think that's a job that a lot of women have in addition to any other job, right? So yeah,
right.
It's good advice. All right. So I have a series of questions called the Fun Five. So close out with that. What's the oldest like shirt or t-shirt that you have and still wear that you've held on to?
Yeah, it's like cut up now. I got it. I got it at a dance gig, a show that I went to, and it's got like a dancer's leg upside down on it. It's cute. And like I don't want to get rid of it. So I cut it so it's kind of cutesy off the shoulder. I wear it to dance class, or I wear it as a pajama.
Nice. That's cool. All right. So a lot of the time, and you mentioned being on Zoom, and yeah, it's just like the fatigue with all that is real. And every day it seemed like Groundhog's Day a lot of the time, like that film, right? If it was really Groundhog's Day, what song would you set your alarm to play every morning?
Well, I'm going to say something. I hate nothing more than waking up to an alarm. And I'm an early bird, and I haven't woken up to an alarm in a long time. I like ping, I'm up at like the crack of dawn. If I had to, because I hate alarms so badly, I'd probably want to I'd want to like ease myself into the morning with something gentle, like, I don't know, Tibetan chimes or something like that. I hate an alarm.
Yeah, you know what? I actually do too. My schedule's been way different now that this happened, and you know, living over here, but I rarely will set an alarm. I mean, unless I absolutely have to, because it's annoying, and there's never a good one, right? It's always like some noise that just triggers you later. Like, you know, if you set your phone alarm and then you hear someone has that as their ringtone, like later in the day.
Yeah.
All right. Coffee or tea or neither?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. I do coffee in the mornings. I have a little French press. It's supposed to make, I guess, like 4 cups of coffee, and I drink the whole thing every day, starting at like, I'm a coffee reheater.
Yeah.
So I'll start drinking my coffee like 7 a.m. and then it's like 10, 11 and I'm popping in the microwave. And then I like to do teas in the evening.
Can you think of a time you laughed so hard you cried or couldn't stop, or something that makes you do that?
Oh my gosh. So I have a girlfriend that I perform flamenco with, and we cannot be on stage together. Flamenco can be like, you have to tap in, and sometimes it's lighthearted, sometimes it's not. And one time we were it was very theatrical, and we had to like come out under a spotlight in this black box theater. And so we can't see anybody but each other. And we get in the middle of the stage, and we're hitting the floor with these sticks. It's like really intense and dramatic. We started cracking up. Everyone was so mad at us that we could not control it. And then it just became a thing where whenever we were on stage together, I'd be like, oh my God, don't look at me. Oh my God, don't look at me. Like, it just, I don't know, like that, like when you know you're not supposed to laugh, it just makes it that much harder not to. And yeah, I haven't outgrown that at all.
I can imagine that would have been funny to see. If I was an audience, I probably would have laughed, but yeah, I can see how you
we got hired to do an opera together, like as dancers, you know, an opera. The opera was like, you were paying $400 a ticket. And I was like, oh my God, we cannot mess this up. Just don't look at me. Don't look
just like wear blinders. They're like, why are those two wearing blue blockers? That's great. I like that. And who inspires you right now?
Oh my gosh. I just discovered a new person I really want to read about. His name's Tony. I'm going to mess this up. I'm really excited to learn more about this guy. He just sounds so inspiring. He was a labor leader, Tony Mazzocchi, who was a labor leader that was really passionate about democratic unionism. So very worker driven worker organizations, which, people might, I don't know if your audience, how familiar folks are with unions, but it really varies the degree to which they're led by actual members and workers.
Yeah.
Sometimes people see unions as a service that they're buying with their dues. He was very passionate about worker-driven organizations, and I really want to learn. I want to learn more about him. So he seems really inspiring.
Nice. So I guess just the last thing is, what if people want to look you up? I know you're not huge on social media, but if they want to look you up or look up something important about you or know more, where do you want them to go?
Yeah, you know what? I suck at this. I still have to make a LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. And I'm on Instagram. I think I probably have both of them on private, but you can try to add me. Send me a message maybe. And yeah, I guess I don't really have a big online presence. It hasn't been my thing, but I probably should at some point get around to that.
Yeah, that's all right. And then they can look up Fair Trade USA also if they're interested in knowing more about what you're doing. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jamie, this was great. I really loved learning all this, and thanks for just being so generous with sharing your experiences and also educating about fair trade and labor unions. And I think it was really educational for me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Fun conversation. Glad we made it happen, Rabia.
Me too. Thanks again for listening this week. You can find out more about the guest in the show notes and at rabiasaid.com. Joe Mafia created the music just for this podcast. Find him on Spotify. That's Joe, Maffia. And Rob Metke is responsible for our visual design. You can find him online by searching for Rob, Metke. Thanks, Rob. Let me know who you'd like to hear from or about your own experiences defining yourself outside of work. Follow at More Than Work Pod or send a message on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Or visit our website, morethanworkpod.com. Give us a follow on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review if you like. Thanks for listening to More Than Work. While being kind to others, don't forget to be kind to yourself.